Okay, so good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world today. I'm Kelsey Timler. I'm a white settler, currently joining today from the unceded and occupied territories of the Homalkam-speaking people of the Stolo First Nation. So I'm in British Columbia, Western Canada. It's beautiful and sunny out, and I'm looking forward to this and then escaping into my garden. I'm here to talk about a couple projects that I've worked on over the years, all about food justice as a way to support holistic health, social well-being, and change. So just a little bit more about who I am. I am, as I mentioned, a white settler, so I come with a lot of privilege, both as an academic and because of the skin that I wear in the country that I live in. I grew up with a full fridge and a loving relationship to food within my family. This led me to working as a professional cook and also enjoying a lot of time in nature, picking berries, fishing, engaging in the natural world, and thinking about where was food coming from. As I got into academia, I started learning about the histories of oppression and genocide and the way that food is used as a tool of violence in different contexts, which has really led me into the work that I'm doing today. So a bit about the Canadian context for folks who don't know. Our country is founded on historic and ongoing white supremacy and systemic oppression. Within this context, our prison system criminalizes poverty and mental illness. So the vast majority of people in prison in Canada have economic barriers to well-being, and there's high rates of mental illnesses. The estimation is around 80%, but those are only those that have been diagnosed. So experts say that it's probably much higher. And then our prison system and all the other systems and structures that intersect with it, so child welfare, healthcare, housing, education, are founded on a foundation of colonial patriarchy. This means that there's an unjust overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples within our federal prison system, as well as the provincial systems. Indigenous people account for approximately 4% of the Canadian population and are almost 40% of the population in federal prisons. This injustice is even worse for Indigenous women, who account for up to 80% of prison populations in certain regions. Colonial patriarchy obviously impacts other people as well. So there's disproportionate representations of Black people, other racialized folks, people with disabilities, and LGBTQIA people. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but most people enter in to prison food insecure. There's obviously exceptions to that, and we don't want to generalize. And then the prison system does nothing to address this. So people are then forced to leave back into society after having such a controlled and harmful relationship with food within the carceral system. And they're also food insecure upon release. So I see food and prison systems as interrelated. They're both extractive. Within late stage capitalism, our food systems are based on money, on making certain people rich at the expense of others. And I would argue that the Canadian carceral system is founded on those same logics. In Canada, once you're incarcerated, you are barely paid for prison labor. And I think this is similar across many other countries as well. The highest wage that you could potentially get in the Canadian context is $6.50 a day. And that's only for the quote unquote best jobs. So most people get closer to $2 or $3 a day. And then from that, your room and board is deducted. The cost of accessing phones is quite expensive, and phones, particularly during COVID, are such an important way of maintaining connections with friends, family, and legal counsel. And then the food system, particularly within higher security institutions, is gross, to be honest. And so a lot of people spend food at commissary to actually be able to engage in food and food creation and eating that won't make them sick. And then upon release, parole in the Canadian context is really an open air prison that constrains dignity and well-being. So it's this expansion of the carceral state. And in Canada, and I know many other places across the world, people are leaving prison having not been able to make very much money at all while incarcerated, into these really extreme rising costs of living. So in British Columbia, where I live, the rates of access to food banks have gone up astronomically, even more so during COVID. And rates of homelessness and vulnerable housing are also increasing. So people are forced into this real lack of security and vulnerability. So within this context, obviously food is a source of oppression and control, but there's also opportunities for joy and transformative impacts. So why food justice? I see food as an opportunity to confront power imbalances with the potential to restore individual and collective empowerment and agency. So every aspect of our food system is power, right? From who grows to who gathers to who makes money, who cooks, who cleans, who deals with the waste, every step along the way. And by addressing this and paying attention to it critically, we can use food as a way to enter into discussions about wider social, economic, racial, and environmental justices. Food is also universal. So it's an opportunity to build across differences, different cultural backgrounds related to food, different family histories. But at the end of the day, everybody eats. And it's also quite an opportunity to confront harmful histories of research. So in the Canadian context with Indigenous peoples, there's long histories of extractive and harmful research that has done immense harm and continues to do so, as well as people in prison who haven't had the ability to consent fully to the things that are done with them in the name of science. So my theoretical foundation, all the work I do is participatory action research. So this is the belief that research should do something positive. It centers and upholds the voices of real experts, so people who are either currently or formerly incarcerated and have lived experience and expertise, and then also naming and confronting extractive research histories. And I see food as a research method. It's both relationship and creation. It's an opportunity to get your hands dirty together and to build something new. And as a prison abolitionist, this creative act is quite transformative, I believe. It's also mundane, it's political, it's cultural, historic, moral, socioeconomic. So in the same way that it enters in all these aspects of social justice, it also provides opportunities for us to address different aspects of the world that we currently live in and then how it can be changed. I'm also guided by Indigenous elders and scholars and activists, and found my work in Indigenous and anti-colonial methodologies. So the belief that stories build the world, stories about who should go to prison, who deserves fairness, a right to food, a safe place to eat, and then also the stories that we can use to confront the way that things are, and then all research being relational and reciprocal. So for my master's, I spent a year at a farm in a minimum security institution here in British Columbia. It's 7.5 acres. It's beautiful. You're not actually within the prison, so you don't hear the intercom, like the really messy auditory world that is being an institution. This was a qualitative, ethnographic, and community-based research project where I spent time farming with the men, many of whom are Indigenous, just due to the overrepresentation of Indigenous folks in the system. And so I weeded, I gathered vegetables, I shoveled goat manure, and then I followed the vegetables because within the prison system for this farm, men are able to take some things home to cook. It's a minimum security institution, so they're actually able to bring things home into their houses and their kitchens. Normally, people have, I think it's about $30 a week to access really low quality, kind of bottom of the barrel produce. So working in the farm, they're paid, the very, very small amount that they're paid. And then they also have an opportunity to take this high quality organic produce into their home and to share it with their community. All the other produce is donated to communities. So Indigenous communities, food banks, school lunch programs, and things like that. So I spent time in the farm, and then I followed those vegetables into community and spent time cooking and eating with people to figure how is this food being taken up and what could it tell us about how to improve the project. I specifically focused on one Indigenous community, the Silcotin First Nation in the central interior of this province, so a rural and remote community. I found that the project had immense positive impacts for men's health and well-being. So there's this improvement in food security in terms of access to better quality produce, the opportunity to be out in the sun, the birds, the rain. There was a resident-friendly black bear, not too friendly though, because that can also be an issue when I was spending time there. So it was just really this feeling of quote unquote freedom while still being incarcerated, which is quite powerful. And then the recipients also felt like they were having better food security and being able to build this, tentative relationship with people in prison. The men also got to feel like they were doing something positive. So they were giving back. They were being able to build these positive identities through food. There were also barriers and potentials for harm though. So this unidirectional model of donation that was controlled by corrections didn't allow for the recipients to be anything other than passive. And within the Canadian history, of, quote unquote, poor Indigenous people being helped by, white state leaders who know better, there's quite a huge amount of potential for harm in that. And then also the fact that these men were not being paid very much at all, nearly nothing, and many of them were Indigenous. So in Canada, agriculture and the dispossession of Indigenous people from Indigenous land has a long and colonial history. So to continue to invite men and / force them, right? You need to work when you're in prison if you really want to get out in Canada, to farm land as part of like the civilizing process has really, really dark histories attached to it. So across all of this, there's great potential for community building and healing. The men wanted to know more about where the food was going. The communities wanted to know more about the men. They wanted to come and garden. They wanted to teach about some of their Indigenous medicines, and none of that was possible. So it left me thinking, what if this wasn't developed and defined by corrections? What if it came from a grassroots level? So that's led me to my PhD research, something that we're tentatively calling the Community Table Project. So this is being co-developed at each stage in non-hierarchical and anti-oppressive ways. I'm working with an organization called Elizabeth Fry Society of Greater Vancouver. They support criminalized women and LGBTQ peoples across Canada. I'm working with the branch within my city. And because these women are on parole and not incarcerated, I'm able to pay them a living wage for all of the time that we've spent together. And I'm grateful for the grants that helps me to do that. So this research has really been built from the ground up. So we've spent a lot of time about deciding how to work together, not just what the work is, what happens when we don't agree, how do we make decisions? And food and cooking has been part of that. So this has all been born during COVID. I have been taking my kitchen into the back of my car and setting up in different parks by the halfway house. And then we get together and cook. Each woman decides what they want to cook. They take turns deciding what we're going to cook the next week. And we get together and we cook and we talk about, for instance, what happens when we don't agree. And we're all students and teachers in this work. So we also have topics each week related to food justice. So climate change, globalization, Indigenous food sovereignties. And I have specific guiding questions. I provide podcasts for folks that are interested in doing a little bit more of pre-listening. And then we talk about what's coming up and what we would want our food justice project to look like. Throughout all of this, we've been moving at the speed of trust. So it's a slow process. We've been meeting for about 14 months. I'm grateful to have funding to help me to be able to kind of have this lengthy doctoral research process. And I think that that's really important in terms of food justice and pushing back against the normal timelines and propensity for extractive research that exists within academia. And then throughout this entire project, I'm seeing recipes as a form of storytelling. So inviting women to share different stories from their life about food. We're actually putting together a cookbook, and I'll share a little bit about that later. But I've been meeting with individual women and asking, what kind of stories do you want to share about food? And they don't have to be related to prison. So one woman has a story about chicken cacciatore. It's her mom's recipe, who's no longer here. So it connects her to that person. And then we've shared that meal together and heard stories about her mom. Another woman has a story about protest pizza. She's Indigenous and had a really horrible decision from the parole board that is keeping her disconnected from her daughter for longer. And so we were talking about, when you get together with your kid finally and you're able to live together, what are you going to eat? And they have this long history of loving making homemade pizza. So her pizza recipe is a protest saying, I am a great mother and I'm going to continue to make good food with my kid, even though these systems wants to continue to pull us apart. So across all of this, I see food justice as a research methodology. I was at a conference a few weeks ago and someone was talking about heart methods, so art-based, but like from the heart. And that got me thinking about what gut methods are, which sounds a lot less cute than heart methods. But the idea of research being this like sensory thing, right? Food, you feel it with your hands, you smell it, you taste it, it brings back memory. And what that means in terms of building something together within a participatory action research framework. Food is an entryway. So through this, we've started talking about access to food banks and how horrible the quality of food is in that, and what other people are interested in. One of the women is really, really interested in graphic design. So she's actually working on our logo for the project. and I'm working to find funding to support her to go to school for that. So this entryway into, my goals and interests in the project, but then really co-developed to support individual interests and passions. And yeah, as I mentioned before, it's just spending time, slowing down. Sometimes we have dinner and we talk, and I leave and I think, oh, we didn't really talk about anything on topic. And then you think about it and you realize that the tangents are really where all the data and gold is. So again, food is a type of storytelling, as a research methodology that is founded in spending time together and sharing stories. A couple other examples of this from the previous project with the prison farm are a man who told this beautiful story of being in the garden and using the time to dream about when he gets out and the garden that he will have and how he'll be able to bring his family there and be able to provide for his children in that way. There's another story of a man who was going to the local food bank. He actually got an escorted temporary absence, meaning that he could spend a day out of the prison delivering food to this food bank, and was able to take these random squash varieties that nobody had ever heard of and spend time to actually share recipes with community members. So he got to feel like somebody who knows something and is helping out. And then these community members got to actually spend time and build relationship with an incarcerated man and confront some of their assumptions and stigmas around what that might mean. Also the cabbage roll casserole story. One of the women, the first time that she ever went into a provincial jail, she was met with this really gross bowl of mush. Worst day of her life, and then the food made it worse. Eventually she got out and then ended back in federal and was still confronted with this bowl of, different but same cabbage roll casserole mush. And so has just decided that she hates this dish, which is, tragic for many reasons. And one of which is that she's Métis, so an Indigenous nation within Canada, and has Ukrainian roots as well. So it's like a food that used to link her to her grandmother, but it's been replaced by all these really negative memories. So she came to one of our meetings and said, we should do a whole section of the cookbook based around reclaiming food. And so she developed a recipe that's just absolutely delicious. And then we got to cook it and eat it together and kind of change that narrative. So what is success? How do we measure it? I would say in this context, it's messy and nonlinear. It's not a known thing. The building of something together in community, mistakes are made. People have disagreements. There's times where things feel like they're all falling apart. But how we build up from that and make decisions within conflict is really, I think, the powerful stuff, particularly in a context where people have been so constrained and told what to do and how to do. And there's these really oppressive and hierarchical systems of decision making. So just being comfortable with the messy nonlinearity of it. I think it's important to center empowerment, dignity, and choice across all steps of the process. So there's this opportunity for small acts of resistance towards this larger transformative impact that we're working towards. One of the women I'm working with has shared that she didn't really realize that she grew up food insecure and that she hasn't had food justice in her life until this project. She knew it, she lived it, she embodied it, but she didn't have the language. And so with that language has come power and been able to reflect on her childhood and some of the systems and structures that brought her into the prison system. So knowledge is power. It's an overused phrase, but I think it's true. Another woman has talked about the constant talking about food and being really helpful for her eating disorder, to just normalize it. And now she's really interested in using this project to reach other women who have problems with eating disorders. I think it's also about self and collective care. So making sure that every person is well in themselves and then also as a circle. So making sure that there's safety. As I mentioned before, I'm paying women a living wage, which here is $26 an hour for all of our time together. So making sure that they have consistent economic impact from this work. I'm benefiting quite a lot as a PhD candidate who gets to do this amazing project and, write papers and all that kind of thing. So making sure that that is part of it. And then, providing opportunities for individual people to explore their passions and interests. I mentioned the woman who's interested in graphic design. Another woman's really interested in photography. And through our cookbook development, I've been supporting her to take food photography courses and do some learning online so that she can be our in-house photographer for this project and then hopefully gain other opportunities through that. And then, yeah, at the end of the day, I think it's good food in community, and then food is joy. Food is not assumed to be joyful for a lot of people in the world. Food banks are really about, okay, well, you have your thing of KD and your can of soup, and that's good enough. The prison is really at higher security levels, where all of these women have been focused on making sure that people really don't die from starvation. There's no focus on nutrition and joy. So bringing people together to eat good food just for the sake of good food, I think, is a really radical act and something that I would consider a measure of success. So yeah, our next steps for the community table project, we're widening our circle and inviting feedback. We have an idea of what we want our project to be, and we're going to be doing a bit of a road show around the region in the fall of halfway houses and then prisons. We're finishing our cookbook, so everybody's writing stories and providing art in the way that they want. I work on another project called Art and Justice, where we've been providing high quality art supplies to people in prison since the beginning of the pandemic. So we're doing a targeted art contest around the theme of food justice at the Women's Institution, and inviting people to submit art that will be put into the cookbook, and they'll also be paid for their art. And then our big dream, which is very, very overwhelming, and something that I think I'm going to handle after I'm done this degree, but is to have a food truck. So the vision is to have a social enterprise that exists both within and against capitalism. So it sells food in certain contexts, maybe at food truck festivals, which are all the rage in this area, but then also gifts food and sees food as relationship and reciprocity outside of the logic of capitalism. We're also talking about having a mobile farmers market that can bring high quality produce to areas that are in food deserts or suffering from the logic of food apartheid. And hoping to one day have a regenerative and Indigenous agricultural-led farm where food is grown in a good way that addresses the risks and harms of the climate crisis and allows people to just get their hands into the soil, which can be such a healing thing. And then another dream, and I think something that I hope is a measure of success one day for us, is sustainable funding. We all know that research funding can be great, but the pilot project mentality that gets tied into that, where you have this really great thing and then the funding runs out and then everybody just kind of goes their separate way, and people who have spent so much time and shared so much wisdom are left with nothing. So finding ways to make sure that this is sustained beyond this degree and beyond this project. So yeah, that's it for me. Thank you guys so much.